The silk whispered against her skin like a secret she shouldn't tell. Jane Barron stood before the full-length mirror in her cramped studio apartment, studying the way the yellow dress clung to her curves, the fabric catching light like oil on water. At 24, she'd learned that confidence was armor, and tonight she was going into battle. A blind date her roommate had orchestrated, insisting she needed to live a little between culinary classes and double shifts at the Meridian Grand Hotel. She grabbed her clutch and headed for the door, her heels clicking against the floor. The elevator descended from the 42nd floor, and Jane checked her reflection one last time in the polished steel doors. She didn't notice the other passenger until his presence filled the confined space like smoke, silent, invasive, impossible to ignore. Jinwoo Park stood in the corner, perfectly still in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her yearly tuition. The penthouse guest. The one the staff whispered about in break rooms, voices dropping to reverent hush. 7 days he'd occupied the top floor, and in that week, 3 managers had been reassigned, 2 housekeepers had quit, and security protocols had been mysteriously upgraded. Jane had served him breakfast twice. He'd never looked at her directly. She preferred it that way. The elevator hummed downward. 38th floor. 35th. Then came the sound, crystalline and sharp. His glass of whiskey, forgotten in his hand, slipped through his fingers. It shattered against the marble-tiled floor, amber liquid spreading like blood. Jinwoo Park didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes, dark, calculating, absolutely predatory, fixed on her for the first time. "You can't go out dressed like that." His voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of calm that preceded violence. "Before we continue, kindly tell us your name and where you're watching from. Now, let's continue." Jane's pulse kicked against her throat. "Excuse me." The elevator continued its descent. 28th floor, 25th. That wasn't a question. His Korean accent wrapped around the English words, precise and cold. "You'll go back upstairs. You'll change." Something hot and defiant flared in her chest. "I don't work for you. I work for the hotel." "Yes," he said simply. "You do." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened to the gleaming atrium, guests milling about, utterly unaware of the ice that had formed in that small metal box. Jane stepped out, her legs steadier than she felt. She didn't look back. She should have. The next morning, the hotel's atmosphere had shifted like weather before a storm. Gerald, the floor manager who'd mentored Jane through her first nervous weeks, was escorted out by security before the breakfast service ended. 15 years of service, gone in 15 minutes. By noon, Jane received her new assignment delivered by a stone-faced supervisor. Exclusive. Penthouse service for Mr. Park. No explanation, no appeal, no escape. When she delivered his lunch, poached halibut with microgreens she'd helped prep in culinary class, Jinwoo sat at his desk, 3 monitors displaying information in Korean and English. He didn't acknowledge her presence, his focus absolute, his stillness unnatural. She set the tray down with shaking hands, the porcelain chattering against itself. She turned to leave. "The dress." Jane froze, her hand on the door handle. "What about it? Where did you buy it?" "That's..." She bit back her irritation, remembering Gerald's empty desk. "None of your business." For the first time, something almost like amusement flickered across his face. Almost. The expression vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. "Everything here is my business." The words followed her home, echoing in the silence of her apartment. She tried to shake off the unease, focusing on her evening classes, on the scholarship application she needed to complete, on anything but the way his eyes had traced her figure in that elevator. The next evening, she returned from culinary school to find her apartment violated. Not ransacked. That would have been easier to process. Instead, someone had entered with surgical precision. 6 designer outfits hung in her closet, each worth more than her monthly rent. Conservative cuts, muted colors, elegant prison uniforms, and the black dress was gone. Jane tore through her apartment, adrenaline making her movements jerky and desperate. She checked every drawer, every corner, even though she knew someone had taken it. Someone with keys to her building, access to her life, the audacity to reshape her world without permission. She knew exactly who. The confrontation came at breakfast 2 days later. She'd barely slept, anger and fear warring in her chest. When she entered the penthouse with his morning tray, Jin Woo gestured to the chair across from him at the dining table. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a conquest, the morning sun gilding everything gold. "Sit." "I'm working," she said carefully, setting down the soft-boiled eggs, the sourdough toast, the black coffee that cost $40 a pound. "Not a request." The words landed like a blade between her ribs. She'd been raised by a single mother who cleaned houses, who'd taught her that dignity was non-negotiable. But rent was due, tuition payments loomed, and jobs that accommodated culinary school were scarce. She thought of Gerald's empty desk, the housekeepers who'd quit. The message was clear: resist and be replaced. She sat. Jin Woo ate slowly, methodically, each movement precise. "You're talented. The herb reduction yesterday, that was you, not the kitchen staff." Her surprise must have shown because he continued, "I pay attention." He set down his fork, eyes meeting hers with unsettling intensity. "You're wasted as a server." "It pays for school." "I could pay for school." The offer hung between them like a noose disguised as a rope, like those dresses in her closet, like the black dress that had vanished. Every gift was a chain. "No," Jane said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. "Thank you." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. For a man who commanded absolute obedience, her refusal seemed to intrigue him more than her compliance ever could. "You can go," he said softly. The strange man approached her outside her morning lecture 2 days later, casual in his menace. Sharp suit, sharper smile, eyes that assessed her like merchandise. "Ms. Williams, some friends would like to meet you." Jane had grown up in Chicago's South Side. She recognized a threat dressed as an invitation, the particular weight of words that promised violence. Before she could respond, before she could scream or run or do anything, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Jin Woo's driver emerged, his presence enough to make the man step back, hands raised in mock surrender. The stranger melted into the crowd of students, but his smile lingered like a stain. The driver opened the door. "Mr. Park insists." She got in because the alternative was worse. That evening, she noticed the cameras, discreet, professional, covering every angle of her building's entrance. When she confronted the building manager, he stammered about new ownership and security upgrades, his eyes sliding away from hers. Jin Woo Park had bought her building. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He hadn't just entered her life, he'd purchased it, brick by brick, reshaping her reality with the same precision he applied to everything else. She was living in his property, working in his hotel, moving through a world he controlled. She couldn't breathe in the trap he'd built. Jane stormed into his penthouse office without knocking, propriety abandoned. Jin Woo stood from his desk, unhurried, and in the dimming evening light, he looked less like a businessman and more like what the staff called him in whispers: the Silent Wolf. Leader of the Baeko Syndicate, a man whose reputation was built on absolute control and calculated violence. "You don't own me," she said, hating how her voice shook. He crossed the space between them with predatory grace. "Not yet." She should step back. She should run. Every instinct screamed danger. She didn't move. "The Jade Serpent Triad," he said, his voice dropping to something intimate and dangerous. "They approached you today. They think you're leverage. Because of you. Because of what you are." He was close now, close enough that she could smell his cologne, cedar and something darker, more primal. Defiant, bright, mine. "I'm not." His breath ghosted against her skin, not touching but promising. The space between them crackled with tension, with want, with violence barely leashed. "Tell me to stop, Jane. Tell me you don't feel this." The control she'd always sensed in him, that terrifying, absolute discipline, was fracturing. She could see it in the tension of his jaw, the deliberate space he maintained between their bodies despite standing so close, the way his hands clenched at his sides. He was holding himself back with visible effort. He was terrified, not of enemies or violence or the empire he'd built, of losing control with her. "This is insane," she whispered. "Yes." His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw past the monster to the man beneath, complex, dangerous, utterly focused on her. "It is. Jane realized with crystal clarity that she was in danger, not from rival gangs or threats she couldn't name, from him, from the way he looked at her like she was the only thing in his ruthlessly ordered world that didn't follow his rules. From the intensity of his focus, sharp enough to cut, hot enough to burn, and from herself, from the part of her that wanted to lean into that heat instead of running from it, from the treacherous whisper in her heart that said his obsession felt like being seen for the first time in her life. She was in danger of wanting this, wanting him, and that terrified her most of all. Detective Choi arrived at dawn, his badge catching the weak morning light filtering through Jinwoo's penthouse windows. Jane had been living there for 3 days. Not that she'd agreed to it. She'd simply woken up in Jinwoo's guest room after accepting what she'd thought was a ride home, her apartment keys confiscated, her protests ignored. The Jopak clan made their move, Choi said, spreading crime scene photos across Jinwoo's desk. Jane glimpsed them from the kitchen where she was aggressively making coffee she hadn't been asked to prepare. A message written in Korean she couldn't read but understood instinctively. They're targeting your interests, all of them. Jinwoo's expression didn't change, but something in the air shifted, the temperature dropping, the space contracting. Relocate her. I'm standing right here, Jane said, her voice sharp. And I'm going home. No. Jinwoo didn't even look at her. You're not. She laughed, the sound bitter. You can't just, Choi, handle the Myeongdong warehouse situation. I'll deal with this. Jinwoo finally turned to her, his eyes flat and final. Pack whatever you need. We're moving to the safe house. Like hell we are. But 20 minutes later, Jinwoo carried her from her apartment while she cursed in English and the fragmented Spanish her mother had taught her, her fists beating uselessly against his chest. The building's residents watched through cracked doors, their faces careful blanks. No one intervened. No one called the police. They all knew who owned the building now, who owned everything. The safe house was a modernist fortress in the hills, all steel and glass and security systems that probably cost more than her culinary school's entire budget. Jinwoo deposited her in the guest room, spacious, luxurious, locked from the outside. This is kidnapping, she said to the closed door. His voice came through, muffled but clear. This is survival. Jane spent the first day testing every window, every door, every potential exit, all secured, all monitored. She could see cameras in every corner, discreet as jewelry, just as expensive. On the second day, she staged a rebellion in the only territory she understood, the kitchen. Jinwoo had a private chef who arrived each morning to prepare meals with military precision. Jane intercepted him at the door. I've got it. The chef looked past her to Jinwoo, who stood in the hallway with his eternal coffee, his eternal control. Jinwoo nodded once. The chef left. I'm not cooking for you, Jane clarified, already pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. I'm cooking for myself. You can starve for all I care. Of course, Jinwoo said. But she caught him watching from the doorway as she worked, his eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She made shakshuka, the eggs poached perfectly in spiced tomato sauce, the bread torn and ready for dipping. She ate at the island, her back deliberately to him, ignoring his presence even as she felt it like heat from a furnace. She heard his footsteps retreat, heard his office door close. Later, she checked the security feed, because she'd found the tablet he'd left carelessly on the coffee table, because she was desperate and furious and needed to know the dimensions of her cage. The screen showed multiple angles of the house, multiple angles of her, in the kitchen, in the guest room, in the hallway. He was watching, obsessively. She saw the footage paused on her face, enlarged, studied like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Her hands shook as she set the tablet down and walked back to her room. The nightmare woke her at 3 a.m, not hers, his. The sound ripped through the silent house, a single word shouted in Korean. Hyung! Brother. The anguish in it made her chest tighten despite everything. Jane lay in the darkness, listening to the silence that followed. Heavy, breathing. She should stay in bed. She should let him suffer. He'd earned it. She got up anyway. His bedroom door was ajar. She didn't enter, didn't turn on the light. She left a glass of water on the hall table where he'd see it, where he'd know someone had heard, and returned to her room without a word. In the morning, the glass was empty. He said nothing, neither did she. But something had shifted. Jinwoo came home 3 nights later covered in blood. Jane was reading in the living room, one of the few activities her prison allowed, when he stumbled through the door. Not his blood, she realized with a jolt of relief that terrified her. Mostly not his blood. But his knuckles were split, his shirt torn, a gash across his collarbone leaking red. "I'm fine," he said, heading toward the stairs. "You're bleeding on the marble." He paused, his jaw tight. "I'll clean it. Sit down before you pass out and crack your head open. I'm not explaining that to Detective Choi." She was already moving toward the kitchen, grabbing the first aid kit she'd located on her second day of captivity. Planning for escape, planning for survival, planning for this, apparently. Jinwoo lowered himself onto the couch, his movements careful. Jane knelt between his knees, her hands steadier than her heartbeat as she cleaned the wound on his collarbone. Up close, she could smell him, blood and gunpowder in that cedar cologne, now mixed with smoke. "What happened?" she asked quietly. "Business." That's not an answer. "It's the only one you're getting." But his eyes stayed on her face as she worked, tracking every micro-expression. When she pressed the antiseptic to the wound, he didn't flinch. When her fingers brushed the bare skin of his chest, though, his breath caught. Their eyes met. Held. Jane's hand stilled against his collarbone, feeling his pulse hammer beneath her fingertips. The air between them thickened, charged. Jinwoo's hand lifted, hovering near her face, and for one suspended moment, she thought he might touch her. He pulled away like he'd been burned, standing so abruptly she nearly fell backward. "Thank you," he said, the words formal and distant. He disappeared up the stairs, leaving her kneeling on the floor with bloodied gauze in her hands and her heart in her throat. The video call was innocent. Just Marcus, her ex-boyfriend from culinary school, checking in. They'd ended things amicably 6 months ago, stayed friends, kept in touch. He was telling her about his new job in Portland, asking when she'd visit, his smile easy and familiar on her laptop screen. She didn't notice Jinwoo in the doorway until Marcus said, "Who's that?" Jane turned. Jinwoo stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the screen with an expression she'd never seen before. Cold, lethal, absolutely focused. "No one," she said quickly. "Jinwoo, this is private." "I'm her," Marcus started. "Nobody," Jane interrupted. "Marcus, I have to go." She closed the laptop. The silence that followed felt like standing on a frozen lake, waiting for the ice to crack. "Friend?" Jinwoo's voice was soft, dangerous. "Ex-boyfriend. Not that it's your business. Everything about you is my business. Because you made it that way." She stood, her anger finally breaking through the fear. "You kidnapped me. You locked me in this house. You watch me like I'm some kind of experiment. I'm keeping you alive. And what about my life? What about my school, my job, my future?" She grabbed her laptop. "Marcus got a job in Portland. I could have had that. I could have had freedom." Jinwoo moved to his office without responding. She heard the click of his keyboard, the murmur of a phone call. An hour later, her laptop pinged with an email. Marcus's job offer, rescinded. His visa application for an upcoming Paris apprenticeship, denied. Jane stood in Jinwoo's office doorway, her whole body shaking. "You're a monster." He looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "I'm your monster." She tried to leave at midnight, dressed in dark clothes, her few possessions stuffed in a backpack. She'd studied the security system for days, found the blind spot near the garden entrance, planned her route to the main road. She was halfway down the stairs when Jinwoo materialized in front of the door. He wasn't surprised. He'd been waiting. "Move," she said. "No. I'm leaving. You can't stop me. They'll kill you." His voice was flat, factual. "The Jopak clan has surveillance on every major road out of the city. They're waiting for you to run." "Then let them," her voice cracked. "Better dead than your prisoner." Something in his face fractured. "Don't say that." "Why?" "It's true. This isn't protection, Jinwoo. This is possession. You don't care about keeping me safe. You care about keeping me." "Yes." The admission ripped out of him. "Yes, I want to keep you. I want—" His hand slammed into the wall beside her head, the sound explosive in the silent house. Once, twice, 3 times until his knuckles split and blood smeared the white paint. "I can't—" Another punch. "I can't breathe when you're not—" His voice broke. "I don't know what you've done to me." Jane stared at his ruined knuckles, at the blood dripping onto the marble floor, at the cracks spreading through his perfect control like fault lines through concrete. He was shaking. Jin-Woo Park, the silent wolf, the man who never lost composure, was falling apart in front of her. "This isn't about protection anymore," she whispered. "No." He leaned his forehead against the wall, his breathing ragged. "It never was." The truth hung between them, terrible and inevitable. This was obsession. This was need stripped bare, desperate and dangerous. She should be terrified. She should run. Instead, she reached for his bleeding hand. He pulled away before she could touch him, stumbling backward like she'd struck him. "Go to bed, Jane." "Jin-Woo. Please." The word was broken, a man begging, "Just go." She went, but neither of them slept that night, separated by walls and fear and the awful recognition that they were both drowning in something neither could name or escape. Jane found the file by accident, wedged between quarterly reports in Jin-Woo's office. She shouldn't have been snooping, or maybe she should have been, considering he'd made every aspect of her life his business. The folder was worn at the edges, handled more than the pristine documents surrounding it, marked only with a date, June 15th, 2019. Inside, a younger Jin-Woo, his arm around a man who shared his sharp jawline and intense eyes, but wore his smile easier. Brothers. The resemblance was unmistakable. Beneath the photos were news clippings in Korean, medical, reports, police documents. She couldn't read most of it, but she understood the death certificate. Park Ji-hoon, 29 years old, the same age Jin-Woo was now when she'd met him. She heard his footsteps in the hallway and quickly closed the folder, but not quickly enough. Jin-Woo stood in the doorway, his eyes moving from her face to the file in her hands. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. "His name was Ji-hoon," he said finally, his voice stripped of its usual control. "Hyung, big brother." Jane set the folder down carefully. "What happened?" He crossed to the window, his back to her, shoulders rigid. "There was a coup. 5 years ago. The old leadership wanted me eliminated. I was too young, too Western educated, too dangerous to their traditional methods." His reflection in the glass was ghostly, insubstantial. "Hyung was supposed to be in Seoul. He came back early. He was always doing that, showing up when I needed him, even when I didn't ask." The words came slowly, painfully, like extracting shrapnel. "They came for me at the warehouse. Hyung stepped in front of the bullet." Jane's throat tightened. She thought of that nightmare, of the anguish in his voice crying out for his brother in the dark. "You can't save everyone, Jin-Woo." He turned, and the look on his face was raw, savage. "I couldn't save him, the one person who mattered, and I—" His hands clenched. "He died because of what I am, who I am. So you'll imprison everyone else?" The words came out sharper than she intended. "Lock them away where nothing can touch them, where you control every variable, every risk?" "Yes, no hesitation, no apology. If it keeps them alive. That's not living, that's just a different kind of death." She moved closer, her fear of him finally overwhelmed by something else, understanding maybe, or pity, or the terrible recognition of shared pain. "You're so busy trying to protect people that you're suffocating them. You're suffocating me." His jaw worked. "I don't know how to do this differently." "Do what?" "Care." The word seemed torn from him. "I was taught to take, to own, to eliminate threats, not to—" He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish. The unspoken word hung between them, too large and terrifying to name. For the first time since she'd met him, Jin-Woo Park looked completely vulnerable. Not weak, he could never be weak, but stripped of his armor, exposed. His hands trembled slightly before he shoved them in his pockets. His breathing wasn't quite steady. He looked younger suddenly, closer to the man in those photographs with his brother, before grief and guilt had calcified into control. "Try being human first," Jane said softly. "Boss second. I don't remember how. Then learn." They stood in the failing light of his office, the city spreading below them like a game board he'd spent years learning to master. But this, whatever was happening between them, didn't follow any rules he knew. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "For all of it. The apartment, the job, the clothes, the cameras." His voice dropped. "For making you afraid of me. I'm not afraid of you." The realization surprised her as much as it clearly surprised him. "I'm afraid of this, of what you make me feel." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hand cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about him. His thumb traced her cheekbone, his eyes searching hers for permission, for understanding, for something she wasn't sure she could give. "Jane," he breathed, and then he was kissing her, desperate, claiming, consuming. He kissed her like she was oxygen, and he'd been drowning. And God help her, she kissed him back, her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him down to her, and he made a sound low in his throat, surprise and need and relief. His back hit the edge of his desk, and she pressed against him, feeling his heart hammer against hers, feeling the heat of him, the want. Then reality crashed back. Jane pulled away, her breathing ragged, her lips swollen. Jin-woo looked wrecked, his hair disheveled from her fingers, his eyes dark and wild. "Not like this," she said, her voice shaking. "Not until you let me choose." He stared at her, comprehension slowly dawning. Then he stepped back immediately, his hands dropping to his sides, putting space between them, even though she could see the effort it cost him. "You're free to go," he said hoarsely. "The doors, the cameras, all of it. I'll arrange protection, but you don't have to stay here. You don't have to." He swallowed hard. "You never had to." She should leave, should walk out the door and never look back. Instead, she stayed exactly where she was. "I'm not leaving yet," she said. "But it needs to be my choice. Every day, you understand?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "And no more watching me on cameras. Done. And I want my apartment back, and my job, and whatever you want." His eyes met hers, and she saw the truth there. He meant it. "Whatever you need." The change was subtle at first. Jin-woo still worked impossible hours, still took calls in Korean that ended with curt commands, still carried himself like violence wrapped in expensive suits. But with her, the armor came off piece by piece. They began talking. Actually talking, not the careful negotiations of captor and captive, but real conversations that stretched late into the night. He told her about growing up in Seoul, about his father's expectations, about the weight of the Baeko name. She told him about her mother's long hours, about learning to cook in their tiny kitchen, about the scholarship that had seemed like salvation. "Say it again," she'd demand when he lapsed into Korean, and he'd smile, that rare, genuine expression that transformed his face, and repeat the phrase slowly. "Sarangae. It means—" "I know what it means." She'd looked it up after the first lesson. "I love you." He hadn't said it to her, just taught her the word, but the weight of it lingered between them. She started cooking for both of them again, but differently now. She'd ask what he wanted. He'd request dishes from his childhood that she'd research and attempt, and he'd sit at the kitchen island watching her work, occasionally offering guidance in that precise way of his that was somehow endearing now, instead of controlling. Small touches became significant, his hand at the small of her back as they moved through the house, her fingers brushing his as she handed him coffee. The way he'd tuck her hair behind her ear when she was focused on chopping vegetables, the gesture so tender it made her chest ache. One evening, as they sat on the couch reviewing her culinary school assignments, he'd arranged for her to continue remotely, bringing the instructors to the safe house. She asked the question that had been building for days. "Tell me about him, your brother, not how he died, how he lived." Jin-woo was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he stood, offering his hand. "Come with me." He led her to the rooftop, where a garden she hadn't known existed bloomed in the darkness, lit by subtle ground lights. Someone had created beauty here, had coaxed life from concrete and steel. "Young built this," Jin-woo said, settling on a bench surrounded by night-blooming jasmine. "He said I needed something living around me, something that couldn't be controlled or commanded. Plants die if you're too rigid with them. They need flexibility, adaptation." He smiled faintly. "He was always teaching me things I was too stubborn to learn." Jane sat beside him, their shoulders touching, and listened as he talked. Really talked. About Ji-hoon's terrible jokes and his gift for reading people, about how he'd wanted to leave the syndicate life, but stayed to protect his younger brother, about the promise Jin-woo had made at his grave to never let anyone else die for him. "He told me once that I'd find someone who'd make me want to be better," Jin-woo said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who'd crack through all this," he gestured vaguely at himself, "and make me remember what it felt like to be human. Not a weapon, not a boss, just a man." He turned to face her, and in the soft light, his eyes were unbearably honest. I didn't believe him then. His hand found hers, their fingers interlacing slowly, carefully, like a question being asked and answered. I believe him now. The jasmine scented the air between them, sweet and heady. Above, stars struggled against the city's light pollution, barely visible but persistent. Jane squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses on his palms, the strength in his fingers, the slight tremor that betrayed how much this moment cost him. I'm still choosing to stay, she said softly, just so you know. His eyes closed briefly, relief washing over his features. When he opened them, again, she saw something she'd never expected to see in Jinwoo Park's face. Hope. They sat in the rooftop garden until dawn, talking and silent by turns, and when he finally kissed her again, it was different, softer. A question instead of a claim, and when she kissed him back, it was an answer, a choice. 3 weeks passed like a held breath slowly released. Jane returned to her apartment. Jinwoo had renovated it. She'd argued about it. They'd compromised on her choosing the furniture. She went back to culinary school, though now a security detail shadowed her at a discreet distance. Jinwoo had learned to ask instead of command, and she'd learned that his control came from fear, not cruelty. The hospital volunteering was her idea. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, she'd prep meals in the pediatric ward's kitchen, teaching sick kids to make simple dishes that made them feel normal. Jinwoo had tensed when she first suggested it, his jaw working through a dozen objections. Then, he'd simply nodded. Text me when you arrive. When you leave. I will. It was growth for both of them. On the third Thursday, she texted him from the parking garage at 4:47 p.m. Heading home, one kid made pancakes without burning down the kitchen, personal victory. She never made it to her car. The men moved with professional efficiency, hands over her mouth, a van with dark windows. She tried to scream, to fight, but there were too many of them, and they knew exactly what they were doing. The last thing she saw before the hood went over her head was her phone, dropped and cracked on the concrete, her last message to Jinwoo still glowing on the broken screen. Jinwoo was in a meeting with the Busan distributors when his phone buzzed. Jane's location had stopped moving in the parking garage for exactly 4 minutes. His blood went cold. He was out the door before anyone could speak, Minso scrambling to follow, already pulling up traffic cameras on his tablet. They caught it on 3 angles: the abduction, the van, the license plate that would lead nowhere because these men weren't amateurs. The ransom call came 20 minutes later. Jinwoo answered on the first ring, his voice perfectly controlled even as his free hand clenched and unclenched against his thigh. Park Jinwoo. The voice was distorted, mechanical. We have something of yours. What do you want? Gangnam territory, Myeongdong warehouses, your shipping routes, everything south of the river. A pause. You have 48 hours. Take me instead. The words came instantly without thought. Let her go. You can have me. Minso's head snapped up, his eyes wide. The distorted laugh crackled through the speaker. We don't want you, Silent Wolf. We want your empire. 48 hours. The line went dead. Jinwoo stared at his phone, and Minso watched his boss, his friend, transform into something he'd never seen before. Not the cold strategist, not the controlled leader. Jinwoo Park was terrified. Hyung, Minso said quietly, using the familiar term for the first time in years. We'll find her. Get everyone. Jinwoo's voice was hoarse. Every contact, every favor owed, every camera in this city. Find her. It took 16 hours of Jinwoo not eating, not sleeping, coordinating teams with mechanical precision while his hands shook every time he touched Jane's broken phone. Minso had never seen him afraid before, had never imagined the Silent Wolf could be. They found her in a warehouse in Incheon, near the port where shipping containers stacked like building blocks and the smell of salt water mixed with industrial decay. The rescue was clinical. 12 of Jinwoo's men against 8 Jopak guards. Jinwoo went in first, gun drawn, every movement precise and efficient. He found her in a storage room, zip-tied to a chair, her lips split and a bruise blooming across her cheekbone. Her eyes met his, and something in his chest cracked. His hands shook as he cut the zip ties, his fingers gentle on her wrists, even as his voice fractured. Are you hurt? The question came out broken, desperate. Jane, are you hurt? For the first time since she'd met him, Jin-Woo Park's voice cracked. The man who never lost control was falling apart, kneeling in front of her, his hands hovering over her injuries like he was afraid touching her might make them worse. "I'm okay," she whispered. "Jin-Woo, I'm okay." He pulled her into his arms, careful of her bruises, and she felt him trembling. The car ride back was silent except for the hum of the engine and the city passing outside tinted windows. Jane sat pressed against Jin-Woo's side, his arm around her shoulders, his other hand clasping hers like she might disappear if he let go. "You came," she said finally, her voice small. "Always." He turned to look at her, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and fear and relief. "I will always come for you." The tears she'd been holding back finally broke through. She cried into his chest while he held her, his hand stroking her hair, his lips pressed to the top of her head. He held her like she was the only real thing in his world, the only thing that mattered in the empire he'd built and the violence he'd orchestrated. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry. Not your fault. Everything is my fault." His voice was raw. "Everything you've suffered, everyone who's threatened you, it's all because of me." She pulled back to look at him, wiping her eyes. "Jin-Woo, don't." He cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing the bruise on her cheek with devastating tenderness. "Don't tell me it's okay. It's not okay, but I'm going to make this right." He took her to the Hanok the next morning, a traditional mountain home 2 hours outside Seoul, all wooden beams and tiled roofs and gardens that seemed carved from the mountainside itself. His mother lived there, a woman with Jin-Woo's sharp eyes, and an expression like winter frost. "So you're the foreign girl," she said in heavily accented English, looking Jane up and down with the kind of assessment that felt like judgment already rendered. "Mother," Jin-Woo's voice held a warning. "I'm Jane," she said, bowing despite her bruised ribs protesting the movement. "Thank you for having me." His mother said nothing, but her eyes tracked them as Jin-Woo led Jane to a guest room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a koi pond. He brought her tea, helped her settle on the cushions, fetched the first aid kit with the same precision he applied to everything. His mother appeared in the doorway as he was cleaning the cut on Jane's lip, his movements impossibly gentle, his focus absolute. She watched him tend to Jane's wounds with a kind of wonder on her face, as if seeing her son for the first time. Later, Jane heard her whisper to Jin-Woo in Korean as he passed through the hall. She didn't understand all the words, but she caught the important ones. "You've become gentle." Detective Choi arrived on the third day at the Hanok, his expression grave. He and Jin-Woo spoke in the study for an hour before Choi asked to speak with Jane privately. They walked through the garden, past stone lanterns and carefully raked gravel. "I can offer you witness protection," Choi said without preamble. "We have a program with international reach, new identity, relocation abroad, complete safety. You'd have to cut all ties with your previous life, but..." "No." Choi stopped walking. "Ms. Williams, you were kidnapped. You're a target now. This will happen again." "I know." She met his eyes steadily. "And my answer is no. You understand what you're choosing? The danger, the restrictions, the life you'll have to live?" "I understand." Choi studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "He's a lucky man. I hope he knows that." "He does." What Jane didn't know was that Jin-Woo stood in the doorway of the Hanok, close enough to hear every word. When Choi left and she returned inside, Jin-Woo was waiting in the hall, his expression unreadable. That evening, after dinner with his still disapproving mother, he found Jane on the veranda overlooking the garden. The sun was setting, painting everything gold and crimson. "You can leave," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Choi's offer. You should take it. I'll protect you from anywhere. My reach extends far enough to keep you safe in witness protection, and you'd be free of all this." "I don't want to leave." "Why?" He finally turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was almost painful to witness. "Why would you choose this? Choose me?" Jane stood, closing the distance between them, and took his face in her hands. "Because I love you, you impossible man." The world seemed to stop. Jin-Woo stared at her, his eyes wide, his breath caught somewhere in his chest. No one had said those words to him since his brother. No one had looked at him the way she was looking at him now, not seeing the silent wolf or the Baiko boss or the monster he'd been called, but seeing him, just him. "You," his voice failed. He swallowed hard. You can't. Too late. She smiled despite everything, the bruises, the fear, the impossible situation they were in. I already do. His hands came up to cover hers, pressing them against his face, his eyes closing. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. Jinwoo didn't say the words back. Not that night on the veranda, not in the days that followed. Jane told herself it didn't matter, that she hadn't expected anything, but the silence still pressed against her chest like a weight. Then he started showing her instead. The first sign came 3 days later, when he asked her to attend a meeting at his downtown office. Not to serve, not to wait outside, to sit beside him at the conference table while 7 of his captains, hardened men who'd spent decades in the syndicate, filed in with varying expressions of curiosity and skepticism. "This is Jane Williams," Jinwoo said, his hand resting on the small of her back. The touch was possessive, but somehow gentle. "My partner." In every sense, the room went silent. Minso, sitting across the table, grinned. The others exchanged glances, recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the Silent Wolf. "She'll be learning our legitimate operations," Jinwoo continued, as if he hadn't just upended the syndicate's entire hierarchy. "Real estate, shipping, investments. I expect your full cooperation." It wasn't a request. Over the following weeks, Jane found herself immersed in a world she'd never imagined. Jinwoo walked her through property portfolios, explained shipping logistics, showed her how the Baiko Syndicate's legitimate businesses generated most of their actual revenue. He was patient when she asked questions, impressed when she caught discrepancies he'd planted as tests. "Why me?" she asked one evening in his office, surrounded by contracts and financial statements that made her head spin. "You could have anyone. Someone who understands this world, who speaks Korean fluently, who—" "Because you're the first person who didn't want anything from me," he interrupted, looking up from his laptop. His eyes held that rare softness he only showed her now. "Everyone else sees the power, the money, the connections. You just saw me. Even when you hated me, you saw me." She didn't know what to say to that, so she kissed him instead, leaning across the desk to press her lips to his. He smiled against her mouth, his hand coming up to cradle the back of her head. "Also," he murmured when they broke apart, "you're brilliant. Don't think I haven't noticed you've already found 3 inefficiencies in our shipping routes. 4, actually. I was being polite about the Busan situation." His laugh was quiet, but genuine, and it still surprised her every time. This proof that Jinwoo Park could experience joy. He took her to his brother's grave on a cold Saturday morning, the cemetery perched on a hillside overlooking Seoul. The headstone was simple, elegant, inscribed in Korean characters she'd learned to recognize. Park Ji-hoon, beloved brother. Jinwoo knelt, placing fresh flowers in the stone vase, and Jane hung back, giving him space. But he reached for her hand, pulling her down beside him. "Young," he said softly in Korean, then switched to English for her benefit. "I found her. The one you said I'd find. The one who'd make me want to be better." His thumb traced circles on her palm, and she felt the tremor in his hand. "She's stubborn and defiant, and she makes me insane." A small smile. "You would have loved her. You would have told me I didn't deserve her, and you'd be right." He paused, his voice thickening. "But I'm going to try. Every day I'm going to try to be the man she sees when she looks at me." Jane leaned her head against his shoulder, tears sliding down her cheeks. They stayed there for a long time, the city spreading below them, the wind carrying the scent of chrysanthemums and pine. His mother's transformation was gradual, like ice melting at the edges first. She started by correcting Jane's knife technique in the Hanok's kitchen, her criticism sharp but not unkind. Then came the lessons, traditional recipes passed down through generations, the proper way to prepare japchae and kimchi jjigae, the subtle art of Korean banchan. "Jinwoo's father loved this dish," she said one afternoon, showing Jane how to roll gimbap with precise, practiced movements. "I haven't made it since he died. Jinwoo has too much of his father in him, the stubbornness, the pride." She glanced at Jane. "But with you, I see glimpses of the boy he was before all this, before the syndicate consumed him." "He's trying," Jane said quietly. "I know." His mother's hand stilled. "That's what frightens me. He's never tried before, never let anyone close enough to matter." She met Jane's eyes. "Don't break his heart. I don't think he'd survive it." "I won't." "Good." She returned to the gimbap, but her voice was softer when she spoke again. Call me Iyama, it means mother. Jane introduced Jinwoo to her own mother via video call on a Sunday evening, both of them nervous in ways that made her want to laugh. Her mother, sitting in her small Atlanta apartment with reading glasses perched on her nose, took one look at Jinwoo and said, "So you're the reason my daughter hasn't come home in 3 months." "Yes, ma'am," Jinwoo said, his accent thicker with nerves. "I apologize for keeping her. She's a grown woman. She can keep herself." Her mother's eyes were sharp, assessing. "You treating her right?" "I'm trying to." "That's not what I asked." Jinwoo glanced at Jane, something vulnerable in his expression, then back at the screen. "I love your daughter, Mrs. Williams. I'm not always good at showing it, but I'm learning." Her mother was quiet for a long moment, then she smiled. "Well, at least you're honest. Jane, baby, bring him home for Thanksgiving. I want to meet this man in person." After the call ended, Jinwoo pulled Jane into his lap, burying his face in her neck. "Your mother is terrifying. Wait until you meet my aunts." He groaned and she laughed, running her fingers through his hair. These moments, the ordinary, intimate, human moments, were what she treasured most. The language lessons that dissolved into kisses, the way he'd correct her Korean pronunciation with his lips against her ear, the quiet mornings when they'd walk through Seoul's neighborhoods and he'd show her his city. Not the syndicate's territory or the boss's domain, but theirs. Coffee shops where they knew his order, street vendors who greeted him by name, parks where they could be just Jinwoo and Jane, not the silent wolf and his foreign girlfriend. Seoul became theirs. The evening came softly, as they did at the Hanok. Jane stood in the garden watching fireflies rise from the grass, their light pulsing in the growing dark. She heard Jinwoo's footsteps on the wooden veranda behind her, felt his arms slide around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. They stood like that for a long time, breathing in sync, watching the fireflies dance. "Sarange," he whispered against her ear, the Korean word she'd learned weeks ago but never heard from his lips. In every language, every life, every possible world. Saranghai. Jane turned in his arms, her hands coming up to frame his face. His eyes were bright in the dimness, vulnerable and fierce at once. "What took you so long?" she asked, smiling despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I had to be sure I deserved to say it." His thumb brushed her cheek, catching a fallen tear. "I'm still not sure I do. But I'm saying it anyway because I can't hold it in anymore. I love you, Jane. I love you so much, it terrifies me." She kissed him then, deep and slow and full of promise. His hands tightened on her waist, pulling her closer, and when they broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "Take me inside," she whispered. He carried her to his room, their room now, the one she'd been slowly filling with her presence, her books on the nightstand, her clothes in the closet, her laughter in the corners. He set her down gently, his hands trembling slightly as they traced the curve of her face, her neck, her shoulders. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "I've never been more sure of anything." "All I need is you," he breathed against her lips, her neck, her heart. "Just you." The doors closed on their intimacy, the night wrapping around them, and for the first time in 5 years, Jinwoo Park felt whole. Morning light filtered through the rice paper screens, soft and golden. Jinwoo woke to find Jane's side of the bed empty, panic flaring briefly before he heard sounds from the kitchen, the clink of dishes, the sizzle of something cooking, her voice humming a melody he didn't recognize. He found her wearing his shirt and nothing else, her hair pulled up messily, flipping pancakes at the stove. She looked over her shoulder and smiled when she saw him. "Good morning." Jinwoo leaned against the doorway, his chest tight with something too large for words. She was here, in his home, in his shirt, cooking breakfast like this was the most natural thing in the world, like she belonged here, like she'd always belonged here. "I could get used to this," he said quietly. Jane plated the pancakes, turning to face him fully, and the look in her eyes was pure mischief and warmth. "Good. You're stuck with me now." "Promise?" "Promise." He crossed to her, pulling her into his arms, pancakes forgotten. This, her smile, her warmth, her choice to stay, was more than he'd ever thought he deserved, more than he'd dared to hope for. But she'd chosen him, and he'd spend the rest of his life proving that choice wasn't a mistake. True partnership, complete claiming, mutual and absolute. Finally, Finally, Jinwoo Park had found his home.